From Eternity by Jim Mortimer. My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture such as you cannot even imagine. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Why do we only remember the past? Stephen Hawking, A Brief History of the Universe. 400 billion generations passed before I realized they were intelligent. By the time I understood that they had been trying to communicate with me, it was too late. By then they were a subcognitive organic slime, trickling sluggishly through an ocean of amino acids, blasted by lightning from the burning atmosphere of their molten planet. I watched their sun shrink, curl up and implode. It was the first time I'd seen anything like it. I wondered if it was important. All right, Doctor. I can see you have a lot of questions. So let me start at the beginning. I was born in darkness. At least by the time I was mature enough to form questions concerning my origin and destiny, I had never known light. I had no word or icon for light, the absence of darkness. And yet I would come to know it all too briefly, in stuttering moments at the very end of my life. What am I? Matter like you. Atoms and molecules divided by empty space, intimately linked by an underlying quantum foam of fluxing possibilities. Rephrase the answer? All right, let me think. Well, I'm afraid I can't. But I can add this. When I was younger, it was easy to determine the properties of quantum particles. Their choices were apparently much more limited then than now. But that's obvious, isn't it? I mean, the universe was a much bigger place then. Parents? Define the word, please, Doctor. Oh, I see. The simple answer, always the best, don't you think, is that if I do have parents, I don't remember them. I could have any number of origins. As far as I understand the term, I could have been the result of cellular fission. Though I don't think I was a familial clone, because as far as I can remember, there was no one before me. I was the first to exist, the first to gain self-awareness, the first to pose questions, to seek understanding. I would suggest your term Immaculate Conception best describes me, but for the obvious fact that the term clearly implies a progenitor. To be honest, I simply can't remember. I'm quite old now. Even when I was young, I couldn't remember every thought I ever had. Could you? How old? Well, quite old, Doctor. Immeasurable, I should think. I can only surmise this, of course, but it seems to me that to be what I am, I must have been born in a coalescent storm of fundamental particles. Matter itself, coming into being, created me. I was smashed together in the most violent of births imaginable, and all matter in the universe with me. Given that I was born during a time of flux between a universe without physical matter and a universe composed of physical matter, then time as you understand it is meaningless. or rather has a meaning that changes depending on which state we inhabit. No, I'm sorry, I can't simplify that statement, except to say that the oldest physical matter that currently exists in the universe is something I remember coming into existence. Well, yes, of course, I remember that. It was the first time in a life whose earliest memories I was already having a problem finding room for, that I'd encountered anything like the physical matter you are made of. I made a special note. Wouldn't you? Ah, thought you'd caught me out there, didn't you? Yes, I'm composed of physical matter. Everything in this universe is, but the matter I am composed of waxes and wanes whilst I continue, unbroken. You don't? Oh, I'm sorry, Doctor. I'll try to rephrase. Think of it like this. The chemicals and electrical charges that make up your memories are in constant flux. Matter and energy decays and reforms, changing its state in countless ways all the time. The physical substance of your mind fluxes more violently than any war, yet you do not notice an interruption in the continued existence of self. Of course not. Neither do I. It is simply a matter of scale. Yes, all right. While we are on the subject, why don't we talk of war? Time passed. In another part of the universe, a new sun sprang abruptly to life. This time I observed the process a little more carefully. Where before the star had erupted spontaneously from a tiny but rapidly expanding globe of iron to form a sharply incandescent blue-white orb, here the process was quite different. This second atomic furnace began life as a contracting shell of gas and energetic particles. Over time, gravity bound this material together into a lump of hydrogen, which ignited under its own weight. When the radiation flash subsided, the sun was a huge sullen mass, still shrinking, though now surrounded by smaller, cooler lumps of rock and heavy metals, recently disgorged by the ever-brightening photosphere. Red light brightened slowly to yellow as stray particles of energy combined with free atoms to form molecules bound in the rigid structures unique to physical matter. The area of space surrounding the red star's birth was far less cluttered than had been the space surrounding that of the blue star. I waited, wondering if anything else I observed would resonate with what had gone before. My patience was rewarded when, after a while, a countless number of symmetrical metallic objects appeared out of the depths of the universe, moving rapidly sunwards. The lumps coalesced around the inner planets of the solar system, weaving paths between them as intricate and beautiful as those of any atomic nuclei. Here at last were the patterns I had been searching for. The paths intelligence walked between lonely stars. I started listening then. I wondered briefly what they might be thinking, but all too soon they stopped. Before long, they had also stopped moving around between planets. Their intricate patterns collapsed into chaotic motion, driven only by the gravity of natural bodies. Soon all of them that remained were concentrated on one planet, and even their numbers were dwindling fast. As their ability to communicate faded, so too did their understanding of the universe around them, of language, of tools. As had the first ones before them, so too this new species withered and died, their last moments illuminated by a frenzy of self-destruction. And then the inevitable liquid dissolution followed by the implosion of their sun. As quickly as that, they were gone from the universe. In all my time, I had never seen anything like this. Two distinct species of intelligence, so far apart in the universe that the crawling light from their suns could never have met. destroyed by the same inevitable process. I knew fear then, for the first time. I didn't have a name for it, of course. The name would come later, intricately bound with another word. War. All right, don't think of it as war. Think of it as inevitable change. That's all war is, really. The violent exchange of one state of being for another. It's a universal process. I see it everywhere now. It wasn't always like this. Though for the longest time imaginable, longer than the lifetime of suns, there was peace in the universe. Cool, unchanging peace. Then war came. I beg your pardon? Yes, of course. I'm sorry, Doctor. You're quite right. Perhaps a better word would be infection. Yes, that feels right. An infection, spreading from star to star, people to people, mind to mind. I was the first mind. I watched it happen. Watched mind bloom, fade and die, victim of some nameless, unidentifiable infection. I learned about pain then, loneliness and regret, and death. I learned of that too, for the first time. They were my responsibility, you see. I had to warn them all. About the infection. About the war. You know, Doctor, talking to you now, watching your harshly angular face, your thumb-tucked arrogance, I feel I have made a mistake. That's what you make me feel. That I am inadequate, somehow, and should feel guilty for those inadequacies. If only you knew the lifetimes I have walked, the lives of galaxies I have forgotten. If I could but allow you a glimpse of... I beg your pardon? I'm sorry, you're right. I'm sorry, of course, you're right. The time for self-pity is long past. Now we must speak not of justification, but of explanation and redemption. We must ensure that what has gone before never occurs again. The time is long overdue for a new pattern to form. Let's begin again. I am nameless. I am evil. I beg to learn contrition and earn forgiveness for my sins. Yes, Doctor, I quite agree. Now would be a very good time to revisit those sins. Time passed and light spread throughout the universe. Stars, no longer too far apart for their photonic emissions to meet, infected the universal darkness, blooming, gathering into clumps, fueled by gravity, their mass enticing the smooth, cool beauty of the universe to form knots and whirlpools. Lumpen galaxies formed, at first distantly, then closer together. Some collided. Energy abounded. The universe became frenzied, a dervish of existence of change. And eventually, inevitably, I encountered mind again. This time, communication between us was immediate. I was hopeful of a better outcome, but my hope was not to last. Although we were able to define a common frame of reference, containing a lexicon of symbols and convergent language icons, it proved impossible to sustain a meaningful concept thread during any exchange. This mind, while clearly intelligent, possessed a frighteningly short memory. Continuity for them was impossible. It was as though each generation of mind was born with less knowledge than their forebears. For the longest time I was convinced, given the circumstances, that this new mind was being deliberately obstructive. I learned frustration then, and anger. It was then, in desperation, I became violent. Now I understand how wrong I was. Then it was very different. At that time I had an overwhelming need to help them. Having met mind other than myself, I now had a framework within which to understand the meaning of isolation. I was lonely, and because of my new understanding of time, I realized I had been lonely for a period whose duration would have induced insanity in any other than myself. Worse, I was afraid of that. If this unnamed infection and destruction of mind persisted, I would remain alone throughout all eternity in the universe. I later experienced that. It was something I now wanted to avoid at any cost. It was then I became desperate. Clearly my duty was to nurture these emergent minds, protect them from the infection which they inevitably fell prey, in the hope that one day I would be able to forge lasting relationships with them. Love? Define the word, please. Oh, I see. Yes. Well, if you put it like that, Doctor, I suppose you're right. I wanted love and couldn't get it. That's why it began to hurt them. Tell you what I did? I'm not sure. I mean the memories are... Yes, all right. I know I will have to revisit those times if I hope to earn redemption. It's just very painful for me, knowing the things I know now, relating that knowledge to my actions of so long ago. How would you like these memories presented? Very well. A simple description to begin with, I agree, though I must admit to being extremely frightened by this process. No, Doctor. Thank you for the offer, but I will decline. Mainly because I do not rest. But more specifically, I sense from my interaction from your species of mind that any delay in the assessment process now might make a successful resolution moot. Will I become violent again? I can only say that I do not have that intention now. Of course, the Lords of Time will have to decide for themselves whether I speak the truth. Restraints? Doctor, I don't understand. We have already agreed that it is impossible for one of your kind to place me under any sort of confinement, compulsion, or restraint. Promise? Can you define the word? I don't understand. Can you redefine the word using different propositions? All right. I think I see. Well, if you are sure that an unenforceable statement of intent will suffice, then I will happily give my word. I solemnly promise not to hurt you or anyone else gathered here to assess my intention in seeking absolution for my sins, for any reason whatsoever. Will that do? You are welcome. How shall we proceed? I see. Very well. Here is a simple description of my relationship to the species of mind known as the Ayako. I will try to remain calm. I encountered the Ayako in the same way as all other doomed species of mind I had previously met. The difference was, this time, I knew what to expect. I knew I had to get my warning over as quickly as possible, before they could succumb to the infection ravaging the universe. In my experience, the infection rate was 100%, and the recovery rate was 0. Every species that became infected was destroyed, and every species I had ever encountered contracted the disease. Ancient as I was and powerful, I felt powerless against the unnameable nemesis. I had to do something. My previous attempts at communication had failed, to my cost, and to that of other minds. I was failing in my responsibility. Now I had to try something different. My first encounter with the Ayako took place in the gulf between galaxies. I met one of their outflung symmetries, an ancient metallic object loaded with suspended organic material, traveling at what they would consider enormous velocities between stars. I contacted the extension of the symmetry responsible for decision-making and guidance of the object, and described the extinction threat that its species faced. The intelligence responded with curiosity, but no fear. I sought to further amplify the danger. The intelligence indicated that it felt no personal threat, knowing that my time was short and that successive generations of the Ayako mind would not be able to maintain a coherent and consistent communication. I determined the only effective course of action was to provide an immediate threat to the existence of the intelligence with which I was communicating. My intent was to provide an opportunity for it to comprehend an actual, immediate danger, and therefore learn enough to protect itself when the larger threat arose in the future. Given adequate time for preparation, the Ayako might survive. I destroyed the organic cargo. The symmetry did not respond in the way I had hoped. It showed no fear. It did not attempt to communicate with any of the other components of the Ayako mind. It had been my experience that mind often behaved irrationally in defiance of the logical order of things, but I had planned carefully for this eventuality, and I knew what to do next. My second encounter with the Ayako mind came inside a shell they had built around a small blue-white star. By their standards, the shell was gargantuan, an incredible achievement. The shell orbited the blue-white star equatorially. The polar region supported against solar gravity by moon-diameter pipes connecting water pumped at orbital velocities at right angles to the shell's rotation. Night and day cycles were provided by gigantic sails orbiting within the shell. It was an engineering feat to stagger the imagination. Yet the Ayako I met used the resin data crystals containing the history of their people as fuel for fires, and lived in caves while their magnificent cities were home only to the scavengers and rampant jungles. I wondered if the Ayako mind had already contracted the inevitable infection. I managed to communicate after a fashion, by assuming the guise of a figure I took to be one of their deities. But the exchanges held little meaning. I showed them ancient cities and the ruin to which they had come. I allowed them to glimpse their greatness that had brought them across the universe to their new home. They saw all and comprehended nothing. I told them of the sickness of stars that would swallow them if they did not heed my warning. They cowered and withered and killed their young in my name, but they did not understand. Finally, I retained blue fire upon the tribal communities from holes I made in the skin of their world. They reacted as I had come to expect, their life bleeding away into the jungle as the air they breathed bled into a larger universe they no longer believed in. I couldn't bear the pain and fear, so I left the Ayako to their inevitable dissolution, following their ancient tracks further back towards their point of origin. The Ayako were a star-traveling species of mind. I could afford to let this component die, a sacrifice made willingly if it would save the central intelligence. My third encounter with the Ayako mind came in a galaxy-sized geodesic construct orbiting a black hole, almost as large as that from which I watched the first matter in the universe emerge in a storm of free electrons. Here lived the mind that had long abandoned elements of itself among the outflung regions of the galaxy, fueled by the ingenious conversion of stray electrons falling free of the event horizon. Here where death and life were more intricately linked than at any time in Ayako history, would the hoped-for meeting of mind finally take place. Here also my hopes were finally abandoned. For although the Ayako were an extraordinarily advanced species of mind, they had by now come to suffer greatly for the intergenerational information loss that had proved such an insurmountable obstacle to my previous attempts to communicate with other mind in the universe. In fact, their lives were shorter now than they had ever been. A sure sign of advanced infection and incipient death. I had no recourse but to abandon communication in the hope that a simple attack would provide the impulse necessary for any sufficiently aware components of the Ayako mind to prepare themselves for the major infection I knew would follow. I changed the strong force interactive bond between the molecules of matter from which their geodesic edifice was constructed. I watched in hopeful anticipation as the construct fell into the black hole. There were individual Ayako here, without number, and I saw that each perceived the moment of death with terror and madness. Yet still, no warning came from their deaths to other elements of the Ayako mind. As the last Ayako fell to its death, torn silently apart by gravity's tide, I wondered if I might not have made a mistake. I watched stray electrons escape from the event horizon, and I considered my actions carefully. No, I had acted with good faith and the best of intentions. I had observed, as only a being of my longevity and power could, the evolution and actions of every intelligent species of mind I had encountered. Their birth, coalescence, the ignition of their intelligence, their long fall into the inescapable infection, all had been charted and remained intricately patterned with my memory. My actions against the Ayako mind had been carefully considered and flawlessly executed. I had made no mistake. The fault clearly lay with the Ayako themselves. Something about their intellectual makeup made them incapable of anticipating or even comprehending their own destruction. Fortunately, the Ayako still existed in the universe. Following older, even fainter traces and symmetries, I eventually reached their world of origin, and here my final encounter began. But I knew that time was against me now, for I knew that soon the infection would become terminal. The Ayako would regress to an animalistic state, blast each other apart with internal warfare as their intellect failed, failing eventually to liquid dissolution, while first their world and then their star dissipated into the void. Then another mind, unique in all the universe, would have vanished, never to return, taking with it one of my ever-dwindling opportunities to find love. Sadly, this phase of my attempt to save the Ayako was briefest of all, for none now but one could understand me, and that one had already given herself to prescient madness. I watched as her peers dressed her in thorns and sacrificed her in the name of her mother, and knew that I had failed. I could but mourn the passing of another mind. Unable to bear the last inevitable death throes, I altered the atomic mass of hydrogen within the Ayako star. Their end, at least, was thankfully brief. Merciful? Of course I believed I was being merciful. Why else administer the coup de grace? I did not know then what I know now, what you, Doctor, and the Lords of Time have brought so brutally to my attention. I did not realize time for me moved in reverse of time for every other living thing in the universe. I did not know I was born at the end of all things, not the first mind but the last. That what I perceived to be a terrible infection was simply the natural order of evolution for all life other than myself. If we are lucky, understanding comes before the end. In this I consider myself unjustly rewarded for my sins. For the desperate truth is that my understanding came at the price of many such species of mind as the Ayako. I do not plead innocence, for I know I am guilty of evil beyond measure, but any judgment you are capable of making, in truth I hope for nothing more than to have demonstrated my tragic intentions, and offer nothing in retribution beyond the knowledge that I will exist throughout all of time, arriving at last at that place you consider the beginning of all things, and find my lonely end there, in the singularity that for me is the inevitable destiny of the ever-contracting universe. In all this time, I will never know love. Redemption? Of course I wish for it, but I know now I can never earn it. Even I cannot turn back time. And so, Doctor, I leave you, in full knowledge of my all-too-human tragedy, with such apologies as one so misguided as I can give. As ever, I wish you well, and hope for more. Goodbye. Time passed, the brief, stuttering moment of light at the end of the universe. I waited through the collapse, feeling my own structure contracting with the universe. The end would be soon. I knew it. The Ayako had gone. The ancestor species had gone. The Doctor and his kind had gone. Now only I was left. Time and matter shrank. Heat increased. A steepening ramp I was happy to climb in search of a final end, at what for mine to come would be the beginning of all things. The walls of the universe pressed down upon me, confining me as no mind ever could. I was defined by the space in which I lived, and now that space was ending. Senses overloading, finally, I sensed the end was near. I felt no pain, just light, packed so densely now, it was a physical pressure against me. The pressure became overwhelming, unbearable. Was this what it felt like to die? To have life ended? To know the frustration that everything you hoped and strove for was all for nothing? That it would vanish in a moment of time so small as to be immeasurable. Now it was my turn, alone at the end of all things, crushed from existence in what for them would be a singularity of meaningless potential. Their birth, my death. I waited. The last moment in the universe ended, but I did not. Indeed, a sudden truth ripped through me. I was not alone. I was not even dying. I screamed. I sang. Every part of me altered now, bursting with new life and energy. Truth came then, and with it an understanding I could never grasp while bound by a single universe. The truth. There are many universes, each one expanding endlessly within its own higher dimensional membrane. That the brains move within a still larger space, in directions I could never previously conceive. Colliding potential existing within the brains releases energy. Singularities give birth to universes, each cradled in its own eternity of time. At the end of such a universe, I am born. I believe I am alone forever, but I do not yet comprehend what forever is. Other universes mean other minds like me, an infinity of others, living and touching, if briefly and infrequently, for eternity. The brains approach, touch, part, leaving new singularities kindled where only potential had previously existed. In a space of time without measure, the moment of destruction inverts. I am alive. Alive! And finally, and endlessly, I know love.